Miracle Boy Boxing, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host, the one and only hosting Cruz, bringing you another exciting edition of boxing. Don't forget to hit and to like, subscribe to my channel. It's always greatly appreciated. Stay tuned.
Subriel Matias. If you're not a hardcore boxing fan, the chances are that this violent knockout machine has slipped through your radar. Now, he may not have that stacked amateur background, he doesn't have a massive following, and he definitely wasn't on anybody's watch list when he turned over to the pros. However, over the last decade or so, Matias has been making waves and has fast become known as one of boxing's most feared and revered punchers. His record currently stands at 22 victories, with all 22 coming inside the distance, along with 2 losses. But despite those 2 losses, he remains a top contender, and going by his last 2 performances, he looks ripe and ready to pounce at the next world title opportunity that comes his way. Now, some may have their doubts when looking at his losses to Liam Paro, but with Matias, everyone can agree on one thing for certain: his punching power. And with that kind of dynamite, who knows what the future might hold for the well-avoided all-action showman. Now, let's rewind a minute, because the journey was not a smooth one, nor was it pretty for the man from Puerto Rico. He didn't exactly grow up in a picturesque suburb, and if his destiny in life was anything, becoming a boxing star definitely would not be on top of that list. So then, growing up in the poverty-stricken town of Fajardo in the east coast of Puerto Rico, everyday life was uneventful, tough and dangerous. Because of the struggles that came with living in Fajardo, crime was all too lucrative, and like many of his peers at the time, Subriel found himself caught up in all sorts of bother. It was in 2012 where the law would eventually catch up with the youngster, and after suffering a gunshot wound through a gang altercation, Matias was ordered to serve a 19-month prison sentence in Puerto Rico. And yes, if he ever needed a monumental wake-up call, this was it. In the background, he had dabbled in boxing since the age of 9 and had trained under some experienced coaches. His amateur record isn't one that's well documented, so it's tough to nail down the exact numbers, but safe to say, before he landed himself in prison in 2012, Matias was never on the books to become the next Puerto Rican prodigy. Yes, he had some talent, but nowadays, if you're a boxer from Puerto Rico, pretty much everyone has talent. It's only those who show commitment to the sport that actually make it. So after he served his time, he showed that commitment that was absolutely needed. Now, at the age of 23, it really was now or never for Matias, and he found himself at a crossroads. With little money and support behind him, it was risky to take a leap of faith in a sport as ruthless as boxing, but it might have been even more risky to keep living the kind of life that he was living on the streets. So Matias decided to swap a life of crime for a life of pugilism, and was ready to leave it all in the ring and turn over to the professional ranks. So his first handful of pro fights were at venues close to home in Puerto Rico, and he made his mark straight away, knocking out guys in the early rounds without ever really breaking a sweat. Like most fighters nowadays, the guys that he was knocking out in his first few fights were journeymen and out of his league, but still, the signs were there. This kid had power and he had ability. Then, after knocking out Brady's Prescott in 4 rounds, the same guy who chinned Amir Khan in the first round back in 2008, Subriel was ready to go stateside and begin turning up the heat on his pro career. At the Lakefront Arena in New Orleans was where he made his American debut against Fernando Saucedo, and with no sign of nerves or pressure, he knocked him out in a round as if he'd been here and done it 100 times before. If people were sleeping on Matias before his arrival in America, there were a fair few now beginning to wake up from their slumber. It was then a quick return back to Puerto Rico to knock out Wilberth Lopez. Then Matias found himself back on US soil, ready to take on an undefeated Russian prospect in Maxim Dadashev. Little did he know it, but this would be a fight that would leave a permanent scar on the life and the career of Subriel. So then the early stages of the fight clearly favoured the Puerto Rican. In what was supposed to be another step up through the gears, he showed a maturity you don't often see for someone who had just over 10 fights. Wicked shots came both to the head and body of Dadashev, and without any disrespect, he was getting toyed with for the best part of 11 rounds. On paper it seemed like a cracking matchup, but on the night, Matias was just levels above, and the type of damage Dadashev was taking was at times hard to watch. And although the heart and spirit were there, the level was not for Dadashev, and before the 12th, his corner decided enough was enough, and he never came back out from his stall for the final round. After the fight, Dadashev was unable to walk to the dressing room and was placed on a stretcher, then taken straight to hospital. It was confirmed he had suffered suffered a brain bleed, and despite undergoing surgery, he tragically passed away in hospital 4 days later. As always, our thoughts and prayers still remain with Maxim Dadashev and his family. A tragic outcome that reminds us of the dangers every fighter faces each time they step through the ropes. Now, there is no doubt about it, the loss had an effect on Matias, and 2 fights later he would suffer his first professional loss against Petros Ananyan. It was fairly close on the scorecards, but a knockdown in round 7 for Ananyan secured the W over Matias, and now the man from Puerto Rico would find himself having to rebuild to get back on track. However, he did bounce back 8 months later, dominating against Baltimore's Mike Hawkins and then gaining another stoppage victory over Kazakhstan's undefeated Jukanbayev. So then, nearly 2 years on from his first defeat, Matias rolled the dice again and went back in with Ananyan, and this time the gamble paid off as he stopped his man in round 9. A convincing win and a sign of serious improvement for the Puerto Rican. Now, with the creases all ironed out, it was time for the heavy puncher to up the levels and try himself against some handy fellas such as the very tough and durable Jeremias Ponce. Ponce was 30-0 when he fought Matias, and on paper at least, the fight was built to be an absolute cracker. But in Matias fashion though, it was dominant. Unexpectedly dominant in fact, as Matias schooled Ponce and stopped him in round 5, earning himself the vacant IBF World Super Lightweight title. Now, with this title under his name and the reputation he had built, Matias's name carried an aura, a fear and a presence that nobody else could match. Yes, there were some very skilled fighters in and around the division, but Matias's knockout record made champions and contenders think twice before signing the contract to fight him. But even so, much to his credit, one man did. And that man was Liam Paro. Now, many actually had the Australian beaten even before he got in the ring. Paro had made a name for himself in Australia and had recently secured the best victory of his career with a stoppage win over Montana Love, but the bookies still massively favoured Matias to get the job done inside the distance. Now, on the 15th of June 2024, everything was set up for a clinical Matias knockout once again. I mean, the bookies were backing him, the boxing fraternity had a knockout nailed on, and the fight was taking place in his backyard of Puerto Rico. But this time, everybody had it wrong. The script was just simply the script, and it was torn up by a clinical, technical and fearless Liam Paro. Despite a point deduction in round 7 for holding, he showed his class and put on a dominant boxing display from start to finish, earning himself a very respectable unanimous decision victory over Matias, with the scorecards reading 112 to 115 twice and 111 to 116. So, the Matias hype train had been derailed once again, and the bounce back from the Ananyan loss seemed futile. Now, maybe the blueprint had already been written, and maybe Paro just exposed Matias's weaknesses. Maybe it was a case of box this man smart and he's likely to come unstuck. The critics came back out from the woodwork, and the future of Matias was suddenly under the spotlight once again. Could he ever really reach the top and stay there? Is he too one-dimensional, too easy to read? These were the questions hovering over the once beastly fighter's head. However, 2 stoppage victories over Roberto Ramirez and Gabriel Valenzuela quickly silenced the critics as he showed what he's really about. No matter the setback, this man always seems to return with an absolute bang. So here we are to present day, and his next fight will perhaps tell us everything we need to know about Matias and his future at the top of the sport. He faces off against the undefeated Alberto Puello in July at the Louis Armstrong Stadium in Queens for the WBC Super Lightweight Championship. Now, naturally, if Puello happens to come out on top, it's hard to see a way back to the upper echelons of the division for Matias, but if Subriel pulls it out of the bag once again and stops Puello in good fashion, he's right back in the mix with the other champions. And best believe he'll still have that aura and still be a force in the eyes of any opposition with him in the ring. Whatever happens, this man has marked his place in history. His journey to the ring is incredible in itself, and with the highlight reel of knockouts he's given us, he's been nothing short of spectacular. Win, lose or draw, we're guaranteed action with Matias, and as boxing fans, that's exactly what we want.